Welcome to the virtual colloquium series, In Conversation, Art Museums as Institutions for Well-Being. This series is organized by the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project at the University of Pennsylvania. My name is James Powelski. I'm Professor of Practice and Director of Education in the Positive Psychology Center at Penn, and the founding director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, which I will often refer to as HHF. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us live and to those who are watching the recorded version of today's event. The mission of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project is to understand, assess, and advance the well-being benefits of engagement in arts and culture, focusing on individual and collective human flourishing. We are grateful for the support of the Chris and Sasha Heinz Family Foundation, the Heinz Endowments, and the National Endowment for the Arts, which has designated the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project as an NEA research lab and is supportive both of practice-informed research and of research-informed practice in the arts, culture, and well-being. You can find out much more about HHF, including our publications and how to sign up for our newsletter, on our website at www.humanities-and-human-flourishing.org. Today, we are thrilled to launch In Conversation, part of the HHF Colloquium series. With In Conversation, HHF will host a series of conversations between scientists and practitioners on topics concerning the arts, culture, and well-being. This fall, the theme of In Conversation is Art Museums as Institutions for Well-Being, and features sessions with scientific researchers and art museum innovators. There is robust research indicating that attendance at art museums can increase well-being. In our own research, spearheaded by Catherine Cotter, art museum professionals identified gaps between what art museums are doing and what they should be doing. The greatest such gap they identified was in well-being. Art museum professionals believe art museums should be doing much more to support visitor well-being, but they also indicated that they do not feel equipped to do so successfully. This colloquium series is intended as a step toward helping art museum professionals and anyone else with an interest in this area to think about the roles art museums do and can play in supporting well-being. Before we turn to our two distinguished speakers for today, I would just like to preview the plan for this colloquium. We will begin by hearing a 20-minute presentation from each speaker in turn. Then I will moderate a brief discussion with the speakers before opening it up to a Q&A with all of you. I would ask that you would hold your questions until the end, and when I indicate that we are ready for Q&A, raise your Zoom hand if you have a question you would like to pose or a comment you would like to make. And with that, let's turn to our speakers. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jeffrey Smith. He is coming to us from New Zealand, where he has lived since 2005, and where he serves as professor and previously dean of the College of Education at the University of Otago in New Zealand. Prior to moving to New Zealand, he taught for 29 years at Rutgers University in New Jersey, where he was chair of the Educational Psychology Department. While teaching at Rutgers, Jeff served as a consultant to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where he was the head of their Office of Research and Evaluation. He has written over 100 research articles and 10 books on assessment and the psychology of aesthetics, including the classic The Museum Effect and his most recent Scoundrels, Cads, and Other Great Artists. Please join me in welcoming Jeffrey Smith.
Thank you, James. I'm going to go to screen share here so that you don't have to look at my face. And then, with any luck, I'm going to go to presenter view. There. Is everybody seeing what they should be seeing? I'm getting some thumbs up. That's wonderful. Thank you again, James. That was absolutely lovely. Kia ora koutou, ka mihi nui. I bring greetings from the beautiful South Island of New Zealand, and it's great to see some of my really dear friends in the audience there. And I should say to those people that Lisa, who is sound asleep, sends her best wishes. All right, it's just a little bit after 7:30 in the morning here in New Zealand, and it's a lovely day. Some people ask me exactly where I live, and this is a map of the world, of course, which I'm sure you recognize. And there we are, right there in the center on the top in New Zealand. All right, I'm going to talk today about something we call the museum effect. It is a phenomenon that we kind of stumbled onto, I think a little bit would be a fair way to put this, while working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I had a graduate student, a lovely person named Isabella Vashkelevich, who came up to me one day and said, you know, that wonderful feeling you have, just, you know, when you've been in church and church is just about over, and being a somewhat severely lapsed Episcopalian, I nodded my head as if I knew what that feeling was, but I kind of did know what that feeling was. And she said, I think you get that same feeling in a museum, and I'd love to study that for my dissertation. And so she did, and we got some amazing results and some other results after that. I'm going to show those to you in a minute. But first, I want to present a couple of other research findings that we have found over the years while at the Met, and working with a number of other great museums, including the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where Karleen is. We did a number of wonderful studies down in the Philadelphia Art Museum. But a couple things that we found that play into this notion of the museum effect are that, on average, the amount of time that a visitor spends in front of a great work of art is 27 seconds. And we found that at the Met about 20 years ago. And then with Pablo, we replicated that at the Art Institute of Chicago. So 27 is average, and that includes one or two people who spent a whopping 3 minutes in front of a great work of art. 17 is the median, probably more representative of the typical amount of time. And I'm talking great works of art here, not just any old work of art. So that's one thing we found. And another thing we found, that if you ask people as they're leaving a special exhibition, or if they're leaving the museum at the end of the day, what one work of art really stood out for them, they have trouble often telling you that. They're much more likely to say it was really the whole experience, and not this particular work. They might have maybe a favorite, but it was really the visit as a whole that they think about. All right. Another thing that we found fascinating and perplexing for years is that people will rave about their experience. It was life-altering, it was incredible, etc. We used to keep comment books at the end of exhibitions. But in all honesty, if you spend time in the galleries looking at people looking at art, which we spent a huge amount of time doing, they don't look like they're having life-altering experiences. You know, you might get a raised eyebrow occasionally, but you know, we're not having to rescue people from fainting from these life-altering experiences on a regular basis at the museum. And so that led us to think that maybe what's happening is really a kind of internal, deeper, and yet perhaps subtle phenomenon that's going on. And then finally, visitors take in the museum as a whole. And we emphasize that because a lot of the work that's done on viewing art is done on viewing one work of art. And that work is fabulous. All right. And there's Helmut Leder's group in Vienna that's done great work. Anjan Chatterjee's done great work on this. Paul Locker's done great work, and Pablo has done great work on this with his mirror model. And all of those influenced our view of what we call the museum effect. So this is our model. It begins with a person approaching a work of art, and what we see here is that people will scan a work of art, maybe give it 2 or 3 seconds to make an initial decision of whether they really want to look at it or not. Okay, we call it the Whitman sampler approach to art viewing, and that may be a very dated reference. I don't even know if Whitman samplers still exist, but it's the box of chocolates. All right, and think box of chocolate, Forrest Gump perhaps is maybe we ought to call it the Forrest Gump model. So they either take on the challenge of that work of art, they say this is something I want to spend a little bit of time on, or they don't, and they move on to the next one because it's an art museum, and there are often hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, there's over 1 million separately accessioned pieces of art at the Metropolitan Museum. Of course, they accession each shard of pottery, so maybe that doesn't quite count. All right. So you either take on the work of art or you don't. If you take it on, you start to think about, what is this work of art? What am I looking at? You maybe the colors have hit you, maybe the storyline has hit you, the narrative that's being presented in the work of art, the composition, what the artist is clearly trying to say to you in some works of art. But we think also that when you look at a work of art, it functions as a mirror. And Pablo's got this mirror model, but we're looking at the word mirror in a slightly different way than Pablo does. When we're talking about a mirror here, we're saying it provides a reflection of you. So you see here a person standing on a beach, looking out toward the ocean, all right? And that might cause you to think about yourself. That might cause you to think about, where am I in my life? Where am I in this incredibly large world? Because the person standing on that beach looks pretty small in comparison to the beach. And so we think that looking at art causes individuals to engage in personal reflection and contemplation, all right? And that they bring who they are to that work of art. And the interaction on that work of art sits conceptually somewhere halfway between the work of art on the wall and the person. That's kind of where that interaction takes place. The artist has presented what they've done. Charles Sheeler once said, once I've made the work of art, however it is that you want to interpret it is up to you, and whatever you come up with is fine by me. All right. And so you looking at this work of art are going to have a different experience than I am. You might even not choose to stop and look at that work of art. You might go to the next one. All right. And then what happens at the very end, we think you either decide that your interaction with that work of art was positive or not. And it may not be a kind of a bold decision. I liked it, I didn't, but you have a kind of a feeling that was a satisfactory interaction with that work of art, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe you leave saying, I don't even know why this is hanging in a museum. All right. We've all, I think, occasionally had that reaction to a work of art. Maybe we don't let that out in public, but I know I've had that reaction to works of art. And then what happens is you do this multiple times. You go from one work of art to the next, to the next, to the next, the ones that you choose to look at, sometimes successfully interacting with them, sometimes not. Why? Because they're a challenge. They're all a challenge to you. And they're a challenge that you might find successful, or a challenge that you might find unsuccessful. I have, strangely enough, likened this to doing a crossword puzzle. All right. Sometimes you figure out what the word is that fits in the crossword puzzle, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you actually come back to it later, just like you might come back to a work of art later, or even an exhibition later, to try to see how it's going. And so this notion of these interactions causing personal reflection and being challenging at the same time, we think we can capture some of the ideas of that with Csikszentmihalyi's model of flow. Lisa and I were once privileged enough to have dinner with Csikszentmihalyi, just the three of us. He was speaking at the Met. Nobody at the Met who knew who he was other than Lisa and me. And so we went to dinner with them. And quick aside, I asked him how he pronounced his name, and he laughed and he said 4 words in English: Chick sent me high. All right. And I went, oh God, that's terrific. I said, and if you don't mind, how about your first name? And he said, Mike. So that's a little aside on that. But this notion of flow, it's when you're engaged in something in which you might succeed or might fail. It has to have a challenge to it. And it's completely absorbing to you. And he was a rock climber. God bless him. I would never do that. But it's a series of challenges in these things that we're doing, and you have little successes and little failures, and they accumulate. And we think that's what happens in the museum effect. Also, you're trying to make sense out of who you are, but also who the artist is. And so you engage in what Pablo refers to as the mirror model, or kind of reversing the steps that the artist engaged in. He had a rough idea. He roughed it out a little bit better after he had the idea of what he wanted, and then he finished. You see that very finished, polished work, which impacts you, and you work your way back toward ideas that the artist was trying to present to you. I hope I haven't done too much damage to it, Pablo. So moving on quickly, what we did was to develop a scale, what we call the citizenship scale. Here are some items, and we're recording this so you can look at this at your leisure. And we gave it to people at the beginning of their visit. We gave a second group. We caught them mid-visit in the galleries of the museum, and the third group as they were exiting the museum. And we did this at 2 museums. We did it first at the Met, but then we did it at the Whitney and at the Michener Museum outside Philadelphia. All right. And this is what happened, and it baffled us. All right. People at the beginning, they are down here at a modest level. This isn't really low, but it's a kind of modest level. And this is on their intrapersonal scale. How do they feel about themselves as a human being, and what they're doing in society, and where their life is going? And at the beginning, we see them down here. Mid-visit, this is the Michener, this is the Whitney. They're higher, statistically significantly higher. The group that we would catch in the galleries, in the midst of what we think is this kind of mini flow sort of experience. When we ask them, do you think about yourself and where you're going and what's happening in your life? They give us higher responses. And then at the end, somewhat they're back down again. All right. But if you think about it, we're catching them as they're leaving the museum here. They're thinking about what they're going to have for lunch. They're thinking about where they left their car. They have left this self-reflection mode. And so we decided we weren't all that upset over it, because people were in fact thinking great thoughts for a while they were in the museum, while they were encountering the art. After it was over, it was over. And that makes reasonable sense to us. Interpersonal is getting along with one another, roughly the same phenomenon. The only one that didn't really show was the Michener in terms of societal issues. And what happened there is we caught the Michener people just as they were exiting a Romare Bearden exhibition of these really dramatic African-American paintings and the like. And we think if we'd have caught them maybe 10 minutes later, they might have been down, but we literally were set up immediately outside the exhibition, so they were really quite high. So we're very excited about this. We really do think that while you're in the midst of the galleries, that you are thinking better thoughts about yourself, about your interactions with others, about your place in society. And so, but these samples were samples taken in the museum. They're not the same person all the way through. It's a sample of people going in, a second sample who are mid-visit, a third sample are at the end. And so Pablo and I decided we would replicate this. He was in Vienna at the time. And so we got a bunch of students from the University of Vienna who had to participate in a study as part of their psych requirements. Okay. And so we brought them into a lab. We had 40 artworks, 20 representational, 20 abstract. And this is what they were presented with, this sort of thing. And what they could do is they could pick any one of these works of art to look at. And when they clicked on it, it would increase in size, and they could look at it as long as they cared to. And what we did was we gave them the citizenship scale, or part of it, at the beginning, after 5 minutes, after 10 minutes, after 15 minutes, and after 20 minutes, because we really wanted to see, how does this museum effect take place? Do you go up high very quickly and then gradually come down? Do you increase all the way through and then drop precipitously as you leave the museum? What was going to happen here? So if you're with me, we've got 24 students. We're testing them at 0 minutes, another group at 5 minutes, another group at 10 minutes, randomly assigned, really nicely, tightly controlled. And this is what we found. On the personal scale, these are mean results for the 0 group: 6.16, then 6.20, then 6.05, then 6.30, then 6.03, etc. And I could go through exactly the same set of depressing results for the interpersonal scale and for the societal scale. Basically, our findings were nada. All right, there wasn't the slightest hint of this phenomenon going on. Okay, why is that? I think the secret there is I've been reading some work by Csikszentmihalyi Carbone, and he's got this notion of what he calls MAX, the mode of aesthetic experience. I think that's what it's called, which basically says, if you're a college sophomore fulfilling a psych requirement in a psych lab, that ain't the same as being a person who wants to go to a great art museum and voluntarily decides to do so. Okay, so what we really need there are people who really want to go to an art museum, want to have these kinds of experiences, and want to participate in psychological experiments at the same time. So that's kind of our goal, is to find that set of people. I'm not sure that they actually exist in the world. Wrapping up, what to make of all this. One, art museum visitors engage in art viewing activities that cause them to think about who they are, who they were, who they might become. The effect appears to be somewhat fleeting, which is disappointing, but the museum effect is about what we experience. Change is a much more complex phenomenon. And for those of you who work in art museums, I was explaining this finding to the director at the Met when I was working there, the wonderful Philippe de Montebello. And he said, if this were true in general, then curators and museums would be the most wonderful people in the world. And we have evidence that that isn't true. All right. And, which I thought was terrific. But one other real quick thing. People who reported not having particularly high levels of art background the effect was more pronounced for them. All right. We think as your level of sophistication gets higher, you tend not to engage in this kind of activity, and you look more at who influenced who, et cetera. Okay. And finally, college sophomores fulfilling the course requirement in the psych lab do not behave in the same way as voluntary visitors to art museums. That doesn't happen. It's a problem we're going to have to try and solve somehow. And so, kia ora, thank you very much, and back to James.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff. That was really, really fascinating. I'm sure we have a lot of thoughts and questions. But before we go into delving into those, we'll turn to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Karleen Gardner, who is the Kathleen C. Scherer Deputy Director for Learning and Engagement at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Previously, she served as Director of Learning Innovation at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where she led institutional initiatives in diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, collaborative exhibition planning and interpretation, community engagement, and audience research and impact. She was the founder and director of that center, of the Center for Empathy and the Visual Arts, a multidisciplinary research project focused on measuring the impacts of the arts in fostering empathy. She's a frequent presenter at national and international conferences and a contributor to field-wide publications. Please join me in welcoming Karleen Gardner.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here. So I'm going to talk about art museums as empathy gyms. And the title of my presentation kind of came from this quote. Next slide, please. By Dr. Jamil Zaki, who is an empathy researcher at Stanford. And he calls art empathy boot camp. I'd rather call it a gym because, you know, much like you were saying, Jeff, we're not forcing people to come to art museums. We hope they're coming for their, you know, they're on their leisure time and they want to be there. But he writes, I think of lots of different forms of art as empathy boot camp. It's a lot easier to insult someone in a YouTube comment section when you're anonymous and they're anonymous. And you don't have to see their reaction than when you're right in front of them. The arts act as an antidote to that estrangement and provide you with a very low risk way of entering worlds and lives and minds that are far from what you would normally experience. Empathy is often work. It's an effort that you make to find the commonalities between yourself and someone else. Next slide, please. So thinking about art as an empathy gym, it's really interesting that the term empathy and the kind of the concept of empathy was born out of the visual arts. So an aesthetic philosopher, a German philosopher in 1873 coined the term Einfühlung, which meant a person feeling into an inanimate object like an artwork. And then later, Theodore Lipp kind of furthered that idea and that concept and said that a work of art is not complete without a human being, that when someone is feeling into that work of art, it actually completes that work of art. And then later on, the word was, Einfühlung was incorporated into English and really took on the meaning that it means today, not so much associated with art, but feeling into other people. So I think it's really, you know, that art is an empathy gym, and the fact that empathy was born out of the visual arts, I think even furthers that notion. And I just kind of wanted to talk about empathy because it's a very complex concept, and I've been in rooms with scientists and researchers, and none of them could agree on a definition. So I'm going to give you all these and then tell you the definition that I work from. But there is affective or mimicry. When we see somebody wince in pain or laugh, that we automatically do that. You often hear that humans are wired for empathy, and I think that mimicry really shows that. There's emotional empathy when we understand another's feelings by seeing their facial expressions or body language. Cognitive empathy is when we take that step and try to see the world from someone else's perspective, kind of step into their shoes. And then I really believe that empathy in and of itself is not enough, that it needs to be put into action. So that is compassion, is when we, use all the different other kinds of empathy and use that to kind of really influence the way we act in the world and with other people. And I did want to point out the difference between sympathy and empathy, because a lot of people get the two confused. You can see this little illustration here. Sympathy is, seeing a friend who has a broken teddy bear and says, oh, that's too bad. Hey, things will get better. Look on the bright side. That's sympathy, kind of feeling sorry for somebody. But empathy is when you're really feeling with that person. And you can even see from this illustration, there's a connection. And understanding how that person's feeling, because you yourself might have experienced those emotions or a similar experience. So I just wanted to kind of clarify the difference between those. And then this is the definition that I like to use for empathy. It's by Roman Kusnarek, who wrote an amazing book on empathy that I highly recommend. He's also the founder of the Empathy Museum that you can see pictured here. And he says empathy is the ability to step into the shoes of another person, aiming to understand their feelings and perspectives, and to use that understanding to guide our actions. There are a lot of challenges to empathy. There's one of them is that in-group empathy, that we tend to empathize with people who look like us, who have similar backgrounds. So overcoming that, I see, is a real opportunity through the arts. There's also, empathy is really takes time and patience, and you've got to really be up for it. So it can be a lot for a person. It's work. And also empathic distress, taking on the feelings or trauma of other people, and it becomes almost paralyzing for us, or traumatic for us. So those are just some of the barriers, and I think it's really good to acknowledge those in thinking about empathy. And I think, as I said earlier, art is this great opportunity. It is an attempt to express human emotions, human feelings, the human situation. So I see all the artworks in our collections as these great opportunities to connect people with different times, places, experiences, emotions, cultures that they might never experience in their daily lives. And art can also kind of take that challenging, like it can help promote and be a catalyst for conversations and experiences we might not be able to have with another person, since it is an inanimate object. It helps us maybe become, be more real and have more authentic conversations than we might have if we were trying to have them with another person. So I like to think, like Sarah Conrath's idea of empathy as this muscle. Again, we can build our empathy muscles in art museums. And Sarah did a lot of the research on the decline in empathy. And that research ended in 2009. And I'm hoping she has better news for us around empathy in her next study. But she says just because it's decreasing doesn't mean it's not changeable. And there are a lot of things and practices that we can do to help us exercise and develop those empathy muscles. And art museums are great places to do that. So in our work for the Center for Empathy in the Visual Arts, we worked with people from all different disciplines and started off the center with a think tank. And these are just some of the real key experiences or key elements for creating empathy experiences in museums. Thinking about grounding and mindfulness, creating a safe space where people can feel free to share and be themselves, thinking about feelings and emotions, giving people agency, active listening without judgment, self-reflection, imagination, embodiment, perspective taking, and then finally a call to action, putting empathy into practice. So first of all, thinking about grounding and mindfulness, this is a program that we started at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Next slide, please. And it was during the pandemic, and I will not take any credit. I've only been here for 6 months, but my colleague, Greg Stewart, started a virtual mindfulness program and invited different partners who have mindfulness practices to join him, all focused on works of art. And really, we've had a tremendous response to our virtual mindfulness program. And then the next slide will show you that we are actually really doing this in the galleries now. So we alternate between a virtual 1 month and an in-person, and sold out many months. And the next slide it shares a response from a participant that they've been on a break from teaching due to mental illness, and they've been working through 20 years of varied trauma. And this was such a healing experience for me and a safe one back into art. Thank you so much. So really having an impact, that intended impact that we hope the program would have. And we're hoping to do some research around mindfulness in museums. And then identifying and naming emotions. Obviously, art is a great tool for doing this. You can use abstract art like this kusama. And I know that it's really important. There's a lot of research says that you ask people what the emotions are and they might name 3. And there's so many different emotions, but being able to name those emotions, identify them within yourself and with others is a huge tool in helping us build our empathy skills. And so we've created a lot of activities in museums that help us do this. Like for instance, in this, you could ask somebody to identify a color or a shape that maybe represents the emotion they're feeling at that moment and get them to share that with the group. And then also in the next slide, you can see that, thinking about figurative art, really trying to use paintings or sculptures of people as substitutes for our fellow human beings, and really learning from their facial expressions, their eyes, their body language, what they're feeling, and being able to translate those skills into our daily lives. Embodiment, especially for young people, but it's fun for adults as well. That empathy is in your heart, it's in your head, but it's also in your body. And getting people to create a tableau of a painting and then asking them how they feel at that moment. What sounds would they be making? What are they thinking? So it's a great way to get people involved in perspective taking and really kind of stepping out of their regular, life and thinking about it from the perspective of someone in an artwork. And then perspective taking is obviously a really important part of empathy. And I would like to acknowledge that we always attempt to take the perspective of someone else. We can't ever truly do that, but working to do that helps us become more empathetic. And there are some great tools. Harvard's Project Zero developed global thinking routines. This is one of those, and it's step in, step out, step back. So it's really trying to take on the perspectives of people in the artwork, but then also realizing that often those times those are snap judgments. So asking yourself, what more might I need to know, and kind of dig in deeper so I could have a much better understanding of that person. And it also brings about awareness that perspective taking is really challenging and hard. And so, really working at it is really important in helping us develop better understanding and empathy for others. Another activity that we do on a lot of tours, again, is giving people agency, not being that tour guide that has a route and, it forces you to look at an artwork maybe you don't want to look at. But for this activity, we bring people into a gallery that's a salon hang that's got all different portraits, and ask someone to pick a portrait and to spend some time with it. Next slide, please. And when we were virtual, we were not tied to what was just on the gallery walls. We were able to kind of curate an experience. So these are artworks from different parts of the Minneapolis Institute's Arts collection. And we would ask people to look at these, to find a person they could easily connect with, and think about why that person was easy to connect with. And then we would ask them to find a person that they felt like they'd have a hard time connecting with. and spend a minute or two really looking at that person and asking them if their perspectives changed at all by spending just 2 minutes with one of these works of art. And then also kind of digging in and saying, why did you have a hard time possibly connecting with that person? So really trying to kind of uncover conscious, unconscious bias, or and different issues that you might have in bringing yourself to connect with someone. So doing a lot of reflection, but then also trying to understand the perspective of others. And I will tell you, so many people in these gallery experiences did say that they felt a little bit more open to understanding that person and a little more connected because they spent more time and really looked into their eyes and thought about their lives. Next slide. And then I did want to say that we've had a long-standing, like 10-year program with UPenn Medical, and we do many of the things I described. I shouldn't say we, but my colleagues that have been here a lot longer than me, but really thinking about perspective taking, building a community by telling stories and understanding one another, close looking, not making snap judgments. So really thinking about how we can bring these art museum experiences into, different professional programs and into people's daily lives. And then I'm going to talk about a few other things. Those were mostly tours that we give, but also thinking about programs and bringing outside voices and perspectives, not just being the museum, this, unilateral voice, we're the museum, but bringing in people from that have different lived experiences, different expertise. This was a program we did in Minneapolis with the Advocates for Human Rights. We brought in spoken word artists, asked them to find a piece of artwork in our collection that resonated with their experience. And we were really focused on immigration and refugee stories. The crisis was going on then, as it still is now, but we had a real series around this. So the artists came in, selected artworks that helped them kind of tell their story. They created a spoken word performance out of it. And then all three of these artists engaged with the participants to really have one-on-one personal conversations. So really trying to think about how we can promote empathy through programs. This is another program that we did a few years ago called Girls Design the World, Building Green Communities with STEAM. This was really about developing cultural connection, global understanding, and empathy, an exchange program between young women in Nairobi, young women in Minneapolis, and they used design thinking, which is an empathy process, putting yourself in someone's shoes. And in that process, we're thinking about ways that they could create more green communities. How could they solve environmental issues in their communities? And the program had amazing results. I mean, there was a travel component, as you can see here, but really broke down stereotypes, really did foster more global understanding and connection among these women, from halfway across the world. And then finally, I'm going to just talk about a few exhibitions. Exhibitions are another way to foster empathy, and the artwork itself can foster empathy, but I'm going to focus more on interpretation and some strategies that we've implemented. So this is Artists Respond, Art in the Vietnam War. It's an exhibition organized by the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And we did exit surveys, which were both on site and emailed to people, to visitors who visited this exhibition. And one of the things we were really interested in was perspective taking. So during these exhibits, how often did you think about a perspective other than your own, e.g. that of the artist, the figure in the artwork, someone affected by the war? And you can see overwhelmingly that 75% of people said that they did this. And 47% of the respondents didn't have a connection to the war. So they weren't thinking of someone from their lives. The art in the exhibition really prompted them to think from someone else's perspective. And then we also had an opportunity for people to share, reflect, so that we had these response walls. So the art in this exhibition made me think. And then we had another one, next slide, that we had one that said, how does the art in this exhibition make you feel? Really trying to think about what emotions people are experiencing in museums. And you can see it's a wide range of emotions, anywhere from, you know, gratitude to anger to overwhelmed. Again, thinking about that, you know, empathic distress. We're excited about thinking about doing more with this, but really just trying to kind of start gauging what emotions people are experiencing in exhibitions. And then finally, Hearts of Our People, Native Women Artists is another exhibition that we did at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And I will say the whole process for developing this exhibition was based on empathy. It was a very collaborative with a lot of the artists in the exhibition. And I've got a couple of slides, just wanted to give you kind of a sense of the diversity of the artwork in the exhibition. And we did, in the interpretation of this, we really wanted to humanize the exhibition. So we did a lot of interviews with artists, and we created videos. And from the slide before that, you can see this is 3 generations of artists. And these videos were playing, and you could kind of hear them throughout, the women's voices throughout the show, permeating the exhibition. And then we also did audio tours, which again was first-person narratives, the women artists talking about their experiences, talking about their artwork. And then we did intercept interviews with around 45 people, both native and non-native. And you can see these are some of the kind of the themes that came out of those interviews. The participants felt connected to the artists because of their audio, because of the, you know, the audio and video. It helped them slow down their pace and look closer at the artwork. Female visitors felt connected to other women, especially as mothers. And then people felt connected as members of racial, ethnic, or historically oppressed people. So it really, those audio and video really helped people connect with others and the artists themselves. And then I just wanted to end with a quote by Olafur Eliasson. The arts have an incredible potential for expanding interconnectedness, for reaching people, touching them, and increasing empathy and compassion in our world. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Karleen. That was really amazing. What a proliferation of wonderful things that you're doing. And your ability to present that so powerfully in such a short time is itself, it's really remarkable. So we really appreciate that. Now, it would be very easy with these 2 wonderful presentations to have a lengthy discussion, fascinating discussion about each one on their own. What our goal here, though, is to bring these into conversation. So I'd like to begin with our speakers and invite them, first of all, to enter into conversation with each other. So Jeff, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. And I'd like to invite you to comment on what Karleen just shared with us. I know that based on, you know, one of the chapters in your book, The Museum Effect, is specifically how to enhance the museum effect. And it seems like Karleen and her colleagues are really exploring a lot of these fascinating ways of enhancing the museum effect. So I wonder, just comment on that or anything else that, based on your decades of experience as a museum researcher, what strikes you as particularly valuable about the work that Karleen and her colleagues are doing?
Thanks, James. That's great. I have to say, first of all, I just met Karleen about not quite an hour ago. But about halfway through her talk, what struck me was I have got to get together with her and do research. We have got to collaborate on stuff, because what she's saying and what I've been saying mesh so beautifully together. And I've always been intrigued by the notion of empathy. I did not know that it came from aesthetics. So there's my aha learning moment for the day. So that's absolutely fantastic. And the notion of empathy as being an explanatory force behind why this museum effect phenomenon occurs is very, very exciting to me. And the other thing that struck me when I was, and then I'm going to stop because I know people are champing at the bit to ask questions and talk. The other thing that struck me, though, was your work with portraits, because I love portraits. I love to think about who the artists are, which is why I wrote Scoundrels, Cads, and other great artists. But now you introduce in the portrait, and I've never thought of it this way, there's now a three-way conversation going on. There's the viewer, there's the subject, there's the artist. And to some extent, that's always true. But when the subject's a human being, I think it really brings that notion into focus. So I've got to think about that. And we've got to talk about getting together and doing some research. So those are my comments. Yeah.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeff. Karleen, I'm wondering how you might respond to what Jeff said, besides absolutely, let's do it, Jeff. How you might respond to what Jeff said or anything in his presentation that you think might be particularly useful for your work from a research perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested to thinking more about how actual artworks impact people. I know you did a lot of research around that, and we didn't do that as much. And I think the selection of objects for tours or programs is so crucial in museums, period. I mean, you have to pick, if you're teaching or doing a program, you have to have the right artwork. And we picked the wrong ones many times, but I would love to pick artwork that more based on your research and really thinking about what those might be. I also liked your comment about portraits being kind of a three-way dialogue. And I will say, when we launched this empathy work, everybody's like, empathy for who? Empathy for who? I'm like, it doesn't matter whether it's the artist or the sitter or the person in the group. It's about the skills. So it's not empathy towards a certain other. It's really, just building the empathy skills. So that kind of resonated with me when you said that, because that was a question I got a lot.
And Jeff, if I can just piggyback off that, one of the things that I think you emphasize really wonderfully in your book and in your work is what you call freedom, or we might think of as autonomy, right? So you emphasize that people typically go to art museums voluntarily. They go because they want to go there. And then the way they typically go through art museums is they decide what it is they want to look at. And so, Karleen, I was really impressed when you were talking about the portraits, like you gave people a range, but then you said, now you select the one within that. So I wonder, Jeff, to this question of, what are the right artworks? Is it a matter of just kind of presenting a group of them and letting people make those fine-tuned selections? Because we certainly don't want to present people with, we decided this is your artwork, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the notion that not all artworks would work in each study is absolutely fascinating. What we have found is that people seek out freedom and structure. If they're experiencing too much freedom, they look for structure. If they've got too much structure, they're looking for freedom. A study that Pablo and I did trailing around after tour groups is that we found that a lot of people were hangers-on in the tour group. They weren't really part of the tour group, but they wanted to hear what the guide had to say, but they didn't want to get sucked into the vortex of the tour group where they couldn't leave and they wouldn't have any freedom anymore. But I think that Karleen's notion of we need to think carefully about what artworks we pick, or else they'd all be the same, all right? Or else it wouldn't matter at all. Of course it matters, but we sometimes, I think, forget about that. And I think it's an important thing. And the notion of looking at, here are 6 artworks and how did they differentially affect people makes a beautiful study. I've got a million of them that I'm doing right. I'm trying to write things down that I want to study as we're talking. So I'll let it go at that.
So Karleen, to flip this around the other way, you said you had sometimes picked the wrong artwork. Like, how did you know that it was the wrong artwork? I'm curious what happened.
Just especially when you're facilitating a dialogue with people in the galleries, it didn't accomplish the goals that you had for it. It maybe the emotions were so ambiguous, which I mean, can offer a great opportunity for different people's perspectives to thinking about what those emotions are. And I think just narrative works really work well. I've just had, we've picked artworks that were just kind of a dead end or led people down a path that, wasn't where we had goals towards. So I think that is how that, picking the wrong art, it's more in a facilitated experience where you want the group to engage and really look closely and have a great dialogue. And sometimes, you pick the wrong work.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think you would agree. I think you would agree, Jeff, or let me ask you, would you agree that empathy could be thought of as a subset of the things that you looked at in your research on the museum effect? And it would make sense that there would be certain artworks that would be more conducive to this kind of of experiencing empathy or developing those skills, and some artworks that might be more useful for other aspects of what you're looking at the museum effect. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for certain. And also when talking about empathy, we know that this notion of perspective taking, cognitive empathy, is a developmental phenomenon in children. And widely studied, and we know that it develops as it grows. But the notion that some works of art are more conducive to this than other works of art, and then the question of why are they more conducive? But I might even see it not so much even as an adjunct to the sort of things we're talking about, although that would be important, but also as a vehicle for those other things to occur. And I might there are a lot of names on this board that I don't recognize, and I'm hoping that all of you work in museums. And what I would like to do is say, as a researcher, it is so hard to get into museums to do research. So if you're interested in doing research, please get in touch with us, because having multiple institutions studies would be absolutely outstanding.
Terrific. So just fantastic. And just on that line, I'd like to invite another person into the conversation, Catherine Cotter. I'd like to welcome you to the moderated discussion. You're the Associate Director of Research in the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, and you're spearheading our work on art museums and human flourishing, including, by the way, the study I mentioned in my introduction to this session, indicating that art museum professionals feel like art museums should be doing more to support well-being, but don't feel adequately equipped for that work. So I'm curious, what are some things that you've heard from Jeff or Karleen or this conversation, or anything that you would like to introduce that you think could be helpful for better equipping art museum professionals to support well-being?
Yeah, so something that I heard kind of both, especially from you, Karleen, is you have a lot of programs or just structures that exist to help support these different states of mind, getting people into exercising that empathy muscle or just these broader kind of well-being oriented muscles. And I know in just talking to some of the people in my life who are not as art inclined, perhaps, they just don't know what to do when they go. But they still, like, they get dragged along with me normally, and are often still getting some of these benefits and still engaged in these processes, but are very nervous or unsure of how to start or how to do art. And so I'm curious to hear from both of you. How do you kind of think about that type of audience who's maybe not as intrinsically motivated, but when they do get to these places, they still have these experiences? So how do you kind of think about that type of audience, since I know a lot of it's been more about the willing participant, so to speak?
I like Karleen's better. Yeah.
I think John Falk calls them reluctant companions.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think going with somebody who wants to be there and maybe engaging in a program, but you don't want somebody to join a program and then feel awkward and not want to, participate. So I think being very open and honest about what the experience is going to be. I mean, actually practicing empathy for that person and understanding that they might not want to be there and might not want to share, but being really honest and open and just, say, just, give it a try. There's a program. If you don't want to stay, you don't have to. But I think that's an invitation and somebody to experience it with, and letting them know what they're getting into. You don't want any, I mean, even when we're marketing programs like this, I want to be really, some people just want to come on a tour, be led around the museum and not ever say anything. They want, the font of knowledge to be shared with them. But other people want to be, an immersive, engaging, interactive experiences. But I think being really honest about what the experience is going to be is very important, because it's going to have a really negative effect on somebody if they're kind of forced into a situation like that. So,
yeah. One of the great things about being at the Met is that it's an encyclopedic museum. And so, you can always say, take them to Arms and Armor. All right. Or if it's kids, take them to Egypt. They can see dead people. They'll love that. All right. I mean, that's a saying that used to go around the Met, was that the best exhibition ever would be Impressionism in the Age of the Pharaohs. All right. That way you could get the really popular stuff going. But I think in part, you have to have faith in your institution. You have to have faith in what it is that you're presenting to people. And if they'll give you a chance, that people will really respond to it and respond in a positive way. If you don't have faith in your institution, you should probably find a different institution.
So if I could just jump in on that question, Catherine, and these responses, I think that, you mentioned a little bit ago, Jeffrey, that you see empathy as perhaps a vehicle. And I know, Catherine, in our work, we've hypothesized 5 different mechanisms as pathways from engagement with arts and culture to various well-being outcomes. And we think of the gateway really as being immersion, which is really about attention, which is really, to the point that you make in your book, Jeff. I mean, if it's just 3 or 4 seconds and then they're off, like they're just basically saying, no, thank you, no, thank you, no, thank you. So how do you get them invited in? And I know in an art museum context, the kinds of visitors that you're talking about, Catherine, they're often in my classes, and I require them to go to an art museum. And some of them are like, but you don't understand. I don't know anything about art. I can't really, I'm not sure I'm allowed to enter, these doors. And I think there's a lot of pretension that can come, or, kind of trying to hide, like just pretend that I belong here, but I really, and I think, Karleen, your point is like, no, it's got to be authentic wherever you are. I remember a colleague of mine and I took a group of undergraduates on a study tour of Greece and Turkey, and we were in the National Museum in Athens. Amazing. And I noticed that one of our young men, a college sophomore at the time, was less than impressed. And so I, walked over to him and I said, hey, how's it going? How are you enjoying these priceless works of culture and art? And he said, in a kind of very strained way, I've had enough with looking at naked boys, right? And so the Kuroi, he just saw them as naked guys, like naked dudes. Who wants to spend an afternoon looking at naked dudes? And so I kind of took him under my arm and I said, well, look at the calf and the foot on this particular Kuros and compare that to the one over there. Do you notice any differences? And I think he was relieved that he didn't have to think about naked dudes anymore. He could just, it was something it was a place where he could enter in. And he's like, oh yeah, that one is a lot more realistic than the first one. And then we started having a conversation, right? So finding ways in where people can authentically connect. Catherine, sounds like maybe the best we can do. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. The entry point's tricky. And I know other things that we've been working on with HHF is thinking about outside of like formal programs or workshops and things of that nature. What things can we maybe nudge people toward doing in an art museum that are really going to benefit their empathy or just their well-being in general? So I'm curious, Karleen and Jeff, if you have any thoughts on ways you maybe can give them like a little subtle nudge in the right direction as they embark on these visits.
And before Karleen and Jeff respond, I just want to say this will be our last question before we turn to audience Q&A. So if you're interested in chiming in, making a comment, asking a brief question, go ahead and raise your Zoom hand and we'll turn to you next. So go ahead, Karleen and Jeff.
Go ahead, Karleen.
Well, I mean, I would say, I think we're also talking about facilitated versus non-facilitated. I think that's where interpretation can be so powerful, whether it's an audio tour that can maybe, give them a guided tour, for people that are not comfortable just, visiting an art museum by themselves. They think they're not going to get anything out of just seeing the art. I think, kind of leading them towards some kind of facilitated, whether it's by a person or by technology, can be really helpful. And then also, if it were, or kind of even a program that's kind of not is, you don't have to make that hour commitment to the tour like Jeffrey was talking about. But just thinking about things like that, and I think as museums, sometimes we get too serious about the art, but we do a lot of kind of programs for young people at night with drinks, kind of like, kind of low risk entryways into museums where you can feel comfortable and confident in the museum. And then hopefully they're going to go into the galleries and explore the art. But really, and then I think trying to just make museums as less elitist and as welcoming as we can, and trying to have a real welcoming, friendly environment, and making people feel like they need to be there and they're welcome. I think there's a lot the museum can do as far as welcoming people and making them feel comfortable, like they will give them the confidence to experience the art.
I would consider the possibility of going out to the groups in your communities, inviting them in a group at a time. We did a study at the Brooklyn Museum, and one of the things that we found in interview groups is that the community didn't feel that the Brooklyn Museum reached out to them enough, which was a big surprise to the people at the Brooklyn Museum, who thought they did a ton of outreach stuff. And we said, I was working at the time with David Carr, the late wonderful museologist, and he said, yeah, well, whatever much you're doing, it ain't enough. All right, you got to do more. And so, if you could get church groups, if you could get the League of Women Voters, if you could get people who are sort of natural allies, where people might not go to museums on their own, but if Mary Ann's going to go, I'll go, sort of a thing, and bring them in multiple, and also establish those support networks with those institutions. The Brooklyn Museum really did try afterwards. They redoubled their efforts. And when they had the big Serrano fiasco, if people might be old enough to remember that, the community groups went to Rudy Giuliani and said, don't you touch our institution. The Brooklyn Museum's our institution. And he backed on. So yeah, look for your natural allies is what I would say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jeff.
Terrific. I love it. So let me pause now and see if there's anyone from the audience who would like to chime in. Again, brief comment, question, whatever's on your mind, just raise your Zoom hand, and we will call on you. So feel free to do that at any point from here to the end. While we're waiting for someone, I just want to kind of underscore what was just being said. I think that's really brilliant about bringing people, bringing groups. It's almost like we tend to think of, Jeff, I'm struck by one of the outcomes of your research that people tend to go to art museums in groups of 2 or more, but they tend to look at the artwork as individuals while they're there, which I think is really fascinating. And I know I've had conversations in front of artworks that I would not have been able to have anywhere else. Right. And the idea of having a group of people, 2 or more, like you say, like an entire group, perhaps, who already have relationships with each other, and then can come and can have, this interaction in a way with the work of art itself, can help to expand and grow those relationships. Right.
Couldn't agree more. And I see hands up, so maybe we should.
Fantastic. All right, let's go to the hands. Marty, welcome.
As James knows, I tend to ask disruptive and blunt questions, so I'm going to apologize in advance. It feels to me that this conversation shifts the goalposts of art and museums. So I'm very old-fashioned about art. I'm in it for beauty. I'm in it for things that give me chills up and down the spine. Issues like empathy are dealt with all over the place: literature, history, television, movies. And I don't particularly see the museum as special or different in that way. But for me, a museum puts me in touch with the beautiful. And that's my question.
That's a great question. And I would say yes, and there was just a piece in the Wall Street Journal, I think about 2 weeks ago. I think very much to your point, I think museums, as museums, we're trying to tell diverse stories, oftentimes from people who have been historically marginalized by museums. And some people agree with that, other people don't. Other people just want to come for the beauty of art. So I think museums can be both of those. But I do think that museums in this day and age need to be thinking more about, beauty, but then also about that art is a representation of what it is to be human, and really thinking about being places where we can discuss and challenge and challenge people's perspectives and viewpoints. So I think there's room for both. That's my answer.
If I might, first of all, Professor Seligman, thank you. Thank you for all the wonderful work that you've done over an absolutely amazing career. Just terrific. And I couldn't agree more. Beauty is the key. I'm 72 years old, and I don't have time to look at works of art that I don't really enjoy looking at. I don't mind being challenged from time to time, but if there's something spectacular and beautiful and something that isn't, I'm going for the beautiful one each and every time. So, and then I get engaged with it, and I wonder who this guy or woman was who made this work of art, what they were trying to do, what was the thought process and the imagination process that brought all this together. Do I have any kind of imagination processes like that I engage in? And does everybody see the beauty in this work of art that I see? And those are the thoughts that kind of race through my mind when I see something spectacular. And it affects me in the art I choose within the museum, and also which museums I go to.
I think there's kind of a thanks, Marty, for the question. You do ask good and provocative questions, which is terrific. It feels to me like maybe there's a way. See if you'll accept this as a provocative response. Maybe there's a way in which beauty and empathy can actually be seen to be well aligned. Beauty, borrowing a page from Mike Csikszentmihalyi, we don't necessarily go to an art museum to find beauty that's just kind of served up on a silver platter for us. Like we want to be in flow. We want to be engaged with it. We want to, as Jeff said, like we want to be able to work at it a little bit. Maybe it's kind of like a crossword puzzle. I love that analogy. And I was just at an exhibit here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art a few months ago, and I stopped in front of one work for probably half an hour, and I was excited because I was figuring stuff out. It was really fascinating, right? And so I almost just kind of passed by it, Jeff, like a 10-second, oh, that's interesting, right? But I invested time in it, and then I'm like, this is really cool. It's fantastic. I was really excited. So I wonder, Marty and Karleen, whether something is similar about empathy, where we just, we're part of the crowd, we're part of the mass, we're walking by people, ugh, I wouldn't want to talk with that person, or, that person looks boring. Or I don't know anything about that person. But if we are able to invest the time in a kind of curated way, we can find the human in these kinds of experiences that are so different from ours. And sometimes that is moving and really beautiful, right?
Yeah, I think to your point, James, thinking about awe and wonder, and if you're, so overtaken by the beauty of an artwork, that you kind of feel connected to something bigger than yourself, at that moment, that is when we are more altruistic and more open to connecting with others. So I think that there are a lot of, that can happen in art museums too.
Terrific, thank you. Roseanne, you had your hand up and then I lost you. Did you still want to ask your question, Roseanne Pagano? We may have lost Roseanne. I see that she had put it also in the chat, and she asked about slow looking. Karleen, could you say something a little bit more about slow looking to describe it in a little more detail, what you had in mind?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think like you were just saying that you almost just walked by a painting and, looked at it for 5 seconds, but that you ended up getting immersed in it and spending time and kind of, unpacking it, if you will. So that's what slow looking is. It's really spending time with an object and by yourself or with a group and really looking at every detail. And it is amazing how much more you learn and see and understand about it if you really take the time and look closely.
Yeah,
I couldn't agree more on that. Yeah, absolutely. And in our studies, looking at how long people look at works of art, sadly, in watching over 1,000 people as they looked at works of art, I think 3 minutes and 45 seconds was the longest that anybody ever looked at a single. And there's just no question that you see things in the 4th minute, in the 12th minute that you don't see in the first 20, 30 seconds. You're looking and you go, hey, wait a minute, that's a snake. All right, that's sort of a phenomenon in looking at stuff. And to Marty's question earlier, Colin Martindale, the great psychology of aesthetics researcher, agreed on that notion of beauty. He didn't like the Impressionists. He thought that was just ragged stuff and wasn't nearly beauty. He liked Bouguereau, which I noticed Karleen had a Bouguereau slide in her presentation. So,
Roseanne, I see in the chat your mic is funky, so no worries at all about that. One of the things that we do, and I teach a course on the humanities and human flourishing as part of the Master of Applied Positive Psychology program every spring, and I ask students to, in non-pandemic times, we're able to go to an art museum and look at the art. In pandemic times, we do this virtually, but I have them look at a variety of works and then pick one that speaks to them for some reason in connection to their well-being, and then to spend at least 20 minutes in front of it. And it just, what the students report after that 20 minutes, it's not easy, but when you, it's almost like a kind of dialogue can take place. And Jeff, to your point, you see things, you see things that you didn't see before, and then you're processing things, right? And then you look again and you see things and you process. So it's a very different kind of experience, I think, than just kind of looking for 30 seconds, which again can give, as you point out, Jeff, can give a lot of information. And to your point, Karleen, it's a yes and, right? There's no one right way or wrong way of looking at an art museum. There are a lot of different possibilities, which is partly why one of the reasons why I was so excited to hear your talk, Karleen, with all these innovative, kinds of approaches, and just thinking the more we focus on, the museum effect, well-being, looking at art, being in an art museum as a vehicle for well-being, how many more of these, ideas we'll be able to come up with, to try out, and then to test and to research. So speaking of research, Liza, I see you have your hand up from the Barnes Foundation. So Liza, welcome. Let's hear what's on your heart, what's in your mind.
And my heart. Thank you.
Your heart.
And apologies, I am en route to back to school night. I have so many thoughts, and hello, Karleen, again, and Catherine. It's this talk, I was enlightened by Jeff's work, and I am actually a researcher who is now a museum professional. So we are kind of restructuring at the Barnes, where we have an internal research and evaluation function. I am the embodiment of it, and we'd love to partner with you for future work. I see, and I want to pick up on Dr. Seligman's comment as well around sort of value, social value, psychological value, kind of aesthetic value of experience within a museum setting. And I know we were just honored to share with Catherine and team kind of a little bit about our newly immersive ways to what we hope will engender these both empathy. This happens to be a digital experience, but I saw in the chat, new ways of new pathways and kind of rethinking environments. And so it's more of a comment and an eagerness to carry the work forward and just introduce myself and thank you for this really enriching conversation.
Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Liza. Great to have you here. And, one of the really exciting things about rich conversations is that they don't end here. They continue. And so we're looking forward to what kinds of things can follow on from this conversation. Just in closing, I might ask a question of you, Jeff, and Karleen too. I think it's related to both of your works, but it's a problem, Catherine, that you and I have kind of beat our heads against, or are beating our heads against potentially, and that is the kind of the fleeting nature of some of these experiences, right? And so in some of the work, Catherine, you did even before you joined our group at Penn, you were seeing that there was a window, right, of effect, maybe lasting for what, like a day or something like that. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, so we
briefly?
did. I also went to the University of Vienna for a couple summers and did some work with the group over there. And we were able to track people for 2 weeks. And in the middle of this, they went to a particular exhibit at an art museum. And so we were tracking things like empathy, satisfaction with different domains of their life, their emotional well-being, whole range of things. And what we were seeing is that the day that they went and maybe a day or two after, they felt more empathetic, they felt more interested and willing to help others. They felt fewer negative emotions, particularly things like jealousy was a really interesting one. So this was an exhibit on immigration and refugees, interesting enough, Karleen, compared to what you were looking at. And so we saw it last for a couple of days and then people returned to baseline. And so we've been thinking about, well, how do we keep people in these kind of states of mind where they are engaging in these empathetic processes and are more interested in and invested in engaging in them?
So here's a question. Is it fine that these experiences are fleeting? Is it kind of like having lunch? You might have a really good lunch, but you're ready for dinner when the evening comes around. Is that how we should think of it? Should we think of it as, oh, there's this window of opportunity that's opening and something needs to happen to turn this experience, into behavior, so that people actually, will take steps to change their lives afterwards? Or does that happen naturally? Is it something that as they think about the experience over the course of the next few days, maybe, in other words, is it fine? Is it something we can enhance? Should we try to enhance that, elongate, deepen? Curious what your thoughts are, Jeff and Karleen.
I think it is. I think you're right. I think it is fleeting, but I think it is also cumulative. All right. And that you have this experience, and then if another one comes along, etc. A while ago, we did a study of a program at Te Papa, which is New Zealand's major museum, and it was on Gallipoli, all right, which is really big if you're a New Zealander, all right. And it was, I was in a 6th grade classroom with kids on TV watching a docent from Te Papa with an iPhone doing a guided tour of the Gallipoli exhibition. All right. Did a brilliant job. It was, and we watched on the TV, the kids could ask questions, went back and forth. It was really low tech in some respects, but very, very effective. Kids were all paying attention, etc. I did a focus group with those kids a month later. All right. And again, these are 11 and 12-year-olds. All right. And I said, what do you remember? the stories that they told me about what they remembered and the level of detail in those stories was absolutely stunning. They could go chapter and verse, and every kid had a story and every kid wanted to do it. And so maybe it gets put on a back burner somewhere, but I think it doesn't go away. And then to James' point is there a way that we can encourage people to recall and revisit those emotions, those cognitions that they had? That would be a huge challenge, but that's what life's about. If you're researchers, and if you're museum professionals, is going after these big challenges. So the notion of, can we do something with that rich bank of experiences that people have, and I think haven't lost, all right, in order to get them to engage in something that's personal and meaningful. I'd be willing to explore that. I think it's worthwhile.
Well, that's terrific, Jeff. Thank you so much for ending on this note of challenge, lest we think that we have figured it all out at this point after our 90 minutes together. And that brings us to the end of our time together. So thanks again to Jeff Smith and Karleen Gardner for joining us today and giving us such thoughtful presentations and having such an insightful discussion and conversation. So feel free to add any word of thanks you would like to in the chat as well. Also like to thank Catherine Cotter for her insights, and thanks to our producer, Sarah Sidoti, who's the Assistant Director of the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project. Finally, I'd like to thank each one of you in our audience for joining us today. It's been terrific to have you with us. We invite you to join us again next month for our next installation of In Conversation. We will be joined by Dr. Matthew Pulowski of the University of Vienna and Dr. Kate Mulligan, Senior Director of the Canadian Institute for Social Prescribing. We will put the link in the chat now. That meeting will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, October 19. And again, the link is in the chat for you. Please feel free to pass the word along to anyone you think might be interested in joining us. And remember to sign up for our newsletter or just to find out more about the Humanities and Human Flourishing Project, please visit our website at www.humanities-and-human-flourishing.org. So once again, thanks everybody. It was a terrific to spend this wonderful time with you. Thank you, and be well.
Thank
Thank you
you
so much, James.